Shalom for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. So I have basically been the past few weeks talking about Elohim, and evidently today is going to be no exception. However, there are some important points that need to be made and some things that need to be understood. In terms of our understanding of what we have going on versus the understanding that has been propagated over the centuries. So let me start at the beginning. And I've brought this up before, but I want to bring it up again. First and foremost, let me say this. What you think you understand about the Bible, you don't. You have been told, taught, given information. If you really, really, really want to understand the Bible, you need to open yourself to the possibility that you're wrong. And when that happens, you will be given the information that you were looking for in the first place. That's kind of how this goes. And I'm going to explain that here in a minute. But short version is, when I started After His Heart Ministries, there were three questions I asked myself. The first one is why am I doing this? What's my motivation? Do I really want to teach these secrets that have been revealed to me because I know that they're unpopular and I'm about to tell everybody that they're wrong? And nobody likes to hear that they're wrong. But at the same time, I was wrong too. And the truth is that because there really isn't actually a wrong per se, but an unlearned, okay? And I propose to you that the unlearned teaching the unlearned results in bad learning, okay? And the learned teaching the unlearned results in the unlearned learning nothing. What the unlearned need to do is become the learned, okay? So teaching somebody to become learned is impossible. I will explain in a minute. I'll remind you there are three types of knowledge. There is experiential knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and written knowledge. What is written knowledge? Written knowledge is basically going to be anything that has been compiled over the years as information that can be recommunicated through reading or through public oration as a result of reading, okay? There's a few reasons why that's important, but the biggest reason is because we need to kind of understand how that knowledge plays a role in our lives. So let's start at the beginning. In Christian fundamentalism, which would be just absolute staunch, stick to the dogma of the Augustinian cult we call Christianity. You say, how could you say that? Well, because Luther, who was not only an anti-Semite and therefore could never actually have a performing actorship in the show of Christianity without condemning an entire people and generation and action of process. What do I mean by that? I mean, Yeshua was a Jew. And so when we have Luther saying, tear down their pulpits and burn their synagogues, we kind of have a conflict of interest. Well, guess what? The mentor of John Calvin, who's the other side of Protestant Reformation, actually says, well, at the same time, we also have a problem because why? He was also anti-Semitic. But the two of them have something in common. Luther was a member of an Augustinian sect of Catholicism, and Calvin's mentor studied under Augustine, or something like that. Point being, Augustine influenced Protestant Christianity. So when I say the Augustinian cult we call Christianity, I'm not trying to dog Christianity, and I'm going to get to that today, because I know that one of the biggest things that we have in front of us is the challenge of offense, right? I don't want to cause an offense, but I have to tell you, you are unlearned. And unfortunately, you're a parrot. All of you, including myself, are a parrot to some extent anyways. And I'll explain that as well. So in principle, the best way that I can describe this is that I said, does Grand Junction, because that's where we're located, Grand Junction, Colorado, right? Does Grand Junction actually need another ministry? No, there are hundreds of churches here, hundreds, right? And the truth is that experiential knowledge would dictate that a person who experiences one of those churches probably doesn't necessarily want to move to another church. If that was the case, we'd have some huge mega church and all of Grand Junction would go there. Okay, why is that important? Well, two reasons. Number one is because when we talk about written knowledge, what we need to understand is that written knowledge has been processed through a number of translations, copies, and translational bias that is unavoidable. Even I operate in translational bias in that I can interpret words into a meaning that fits what I'm teaching at that moment, right? Although we do try to review things de novo, right? We try to review them as if we've never seen them before, right? That's what Supreme Court judges do with cases. So the premise is that because of that fact, one of the more important elements of our journey is going to be to ask the question, what is the difference between written knowledge versus experiential knowledge? And what is spiritual knowledge? Well, in that context, and believe you me, this is not about those three, but we need to kind of establish some framework here. And that is in its simplicity that experiential knowledge is going to override everything that you have ever heard, been taught, or read. Your experience and your perceptions of that experience are going to override everything. Meaning what? Meaning it will tell you that you think you are right. It will tell you that you think you are in the correct process. What is spiritual knowledge? Spiritual knowledge is that unction, that feeling. Yeshua called it the shepherd's voice, right? We see this concept of this idea of Yahweh speaking in the Ne'um. And the word of the Lord came to me and uttered. That's the Ne'um in the Hebrew, Ne'um. And the importance behind this, or the idea behind this, is that a spiritual unction is something that actually causes you to move in a certain direction. Like, for example, you're driving down the road, you see a car broken down on the side of the road, and something tells you to keep driving. You just really, really, really want to pull over, but something says, don't do it. So you don't. And you'll never know why that thing told you not to. You won't. But you listened to it. So why do you listen to it? What is the reason there? Some say, oh, it's the Holy Spirit. Okay, then let's do some Christian stuff here. If it's the Holy Spirit and it is warning a person to not pull over on the side of the road and to keep driving, and that person is a Satanist, what is that voice? You see, we have a conflict because it says that the Holy Spirit only comes with Christ, right? And the Holy Spirit only comes with Christ. And if you don't have Christ, then you can't have that privilege, right? So we see a problem here. So let's say that spiritual knowledge does not actually equate per se to the Holy Spirit, but instead some unction that exists in all of us, okay? Now, I know that was an extreme, but we got to kind of make it where we understand that this isn't just about a person who is an American Christian who sits in the pew on Sunday morning as an indoctrinated and receives a standard set of dogma, a standard set of morals based upon years, centuries of fossilized customs, as we'll call it. Thank you, Lou White. And then also centuries of infiltration of other religious influences, as opposed to what the truth or emet is. Okay, so experiential knowledge then has a tendency to kind of be accompanied with the spiritual knowledge depending on how much you listen to that unction. But written knowledge claims something about your God. And I hate using that word because we're about to get into a realm where the word God, which has its etymology in German Teutonic tribal stuff, we need to accept that that is just not what we got going on anymore. Sky Daddy doesn't work anymore because all of a sudden we are realizing that we are, and it's the simplicity of the open mind to realize that you are dealing with much more than just a father. In fact, that's kind of a construct of human anthropomorphic assignment. Okay. But the truth is that's not actually what exists within the realm in which we are dealing with the intensification of all power in the universe. As a result of that, we need to explore. But let me go back to my story about After His Heart Ministries. So at any rate, my thought process is if somebody is happy at the church they're at, why would they want to come to mine? What do I have to offer that's different? Or what do I have to offer that's better or an improvement? Well, obviously, I didn't want to get into this whole egotistical thing. So in my humility, I said, well, maybe we offer them a way to know without knowing, right? So the premise was when we first started out that there was kind of this idea that, hey, look, I'm going to introduce a few Hebrew concepts here, show you how they tie into your Christian faith, and we're good. I was never going to reveal the truth about Elohim, about Hasatan, about the Holy Spirit, about any of these other things. I was never going to show the cycle of Israel, which I've known for probably a decade. I was never intending to reveal anything about Genesis in the image of God. I can tell you those things weren't in my mind. My motivation is to give people a little bit of their Hebrew roots so that they could kind of untether themselves from the pulpit, get them curious enough that they would start studying on their own. And I did that. I sought the idea of putting the teachings together in such a way that people would want to know more, but that they'd have to figure it out on their own. I love when we were at the actual local venue, we were in the building. One of the congregants would bring their tablet, hang it over the front of the pew, and sit there and type the whole time. I swear I thought they were texting, but they were fact checking every single thing I was saying. Okay, that's fine. Another thing that I wanted is that if we had a ministry, that we would somehow be better at the things where the other ministries in town had failed, which would have been not in my backyard. Anybody could come to our ministry and participate, and we would create a way for them to be there. So if they had limitations, we would figure it out. Okay, but nobody was going to be turned away. And that was actually Mom's vision for the ministry when she first came up with the idea. So as I took control of directorship and began building this ministry into what it is today, there were a few questions that came to mind. And the first one was, why are we doing what we were doing? Well, I had to kind of get my mind wrapped around that we're going to teach people how to study. We're going to teach people how to be ministers, how to know these things. Well, of course, obviously it exploded into something else, and that's obviously not my business. But one of the things I commit is that number one, I would never prepare a message. I would not prepare a message, and I wouldn't prepare slides. I wouldn't go check scriptures. I wouldn't go fact check any information. And not only that, but I would avoid the subject the entire week until Shabbat, and then explore the subject with you. Okay. What does that mean? That means that we're actually working more with spiritual unction and with experiential knowledge than we are with the actual written stuff, right? Well, in that process, we still have to allow for the written stuff. The Bible is the Bible, and 66 books of the Bible is how I was introduced to the intensification of all power in the universe. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that there isn't a merit for the extra biblical books. What I'm saying is that that's what we have in front of us, right? This narrowed down, non-apocryphal American Christianity translation of the Bible, right? Okay. So in that grand scheme of things, I think it's important to understand that we have a tendency to call the Bible the Word of God. And we have a tendency to look at that in terms of a thought process that somehow, in some way, after the diligence of certain creeds and certain councils and certain canonizations, we came up with 66 books. Those 66 books were divinely guided by people when there were like, 300 different books at one point in time, et cetera, et cetera. I don't remember what the number is. So please don't say that's don't say, oh, we got to fact check him on that. And then all of a sudden is maybe 200. Who knows? But there was a bunch, right? So why is this important? Well, first of all, I think it is very, very important to understand that the intensification of all power in the universe is pure energy. No matter. Not moving at the speed of light, but the speed of thought, which is way faster than the speed of light. And in the entry of the speed of thought means that everything that is going on in that huge, massive, vast, overwhelming, understated, infinite, unlimited existence, that it's way bigger than just this, way bigger than just us humans, right? But also that there is this function of trying to understand what then is a throne per se, or what then is love, right? What is the essence of mercy, right? Those are human concepts. So how do they function in a different realm? Well, a couple of things we probably need to do. We probably need to do a little bit of recap, and we need to remember what an Elohim is. We also need to probably understand how and what the intensification of all power in the universe is and how it functions and what it is, right? But then also we need to understand our finite position in this, okay? So what's a couple of things that we've talked about? Well, number one, of course, we've talked about the premise or the idea that there was this concentric contraction going on, right? From 99% light, 1% darkness down to 100% darkness, and then there was no more contractions. And that 100% darkness was this place that contains no light, which consequently, if we were really to accept that we are light beings and that light plays a role in our process of existence, then one could argue that the concept of being put into a place that does not contain any light is actually impossible, because we are the last, we're the last of the light, as it were. Okay. So let's see, what is an Elohim? An Elohim is a vessel that has a contracted limitation that has received a spark of light that is now intensifying to the outer reaches of its limitation. Why does the limitation exist? Because there needed to be free will. That limitation is simply the word no. I will not allow anything in. And then the second thought is I will allow under conditions. Allowing under conditions, letting that in, obviously, is trust, right? If I can trust that spark of light is coming into this vessel, or if I can allow a spark of light to come into my vessel, right? So there's the process of a conduit to transfer the light into the vessel. There is the vessel and the opening by which that conduit goes into the vessel, right? And then as that happens, there's an inception. There's a planting of that spark of light, or seed, as it were, right? And it somehow converges with what's already in the vessel, and that creates something new in which there is an inception, there's a reception, and there's a conception. And conception becomes this whole new thing. And we also understand that at the energy level is neutral. In other words, it's not polarized. What causes it to become polarized is us and the process by which we polarize things. Energy comes to us neutral, we polarize it, we send it back out into each other in some form, positive or negative. Which means what? Inception, reception, and conception can be malevolent. There can be a planting of a malevolent seed, and there can be a conception of a malevolent energy. Okay? All right, so the next thing that's important to understand is an Elohim is actually the intensification of all power in the universe, contains all of the information, all of the intensity, all of the actual energy and authority, but dummied down, right? Reduced or diminished, all right? And I hate to say that about the intensification of all power in the universe. I hate to say that the God as we understand him, the perceivable God, and I wasn't borrowing that from the big book. I mean, your understanding of God is a very, very, very diminished version of what he actually is. Okay? That's important. The next thing that's important is to understand that an Elohim isn't just the intensification of all power in the universe. An Elohim can be a rock. Okay? Because what is a rock? A rock is actually a solid. What do we know about solids? Well, we know that there is a direct connection between vibrational frequencies, between vibrational frequencies and the actual solidity of matter. Okay. So why is this important? Well, first of all, there is an element of truth to the fact that if you are vibrating at a higher level of frequency, you are probably operating in a higher level of positive energy. And the lower levels of energy are either malevolent or neutral, as it were. Okay. And so in that sense, the lower we go down in frequency, the more that we move into the realm of potential malevolence. The higher we go up in frequency, the more we move into benevolence. In the intrigue of all that, the more we move into lower frequencies, we move into solids. There was a study done where they actually had cancer cells and they figured out the frequency of the cancer cells, introduced a music that actually had a dissonant dissonant frequency in it, and the cancer cells started to break up. It wasn't a cure, but the cancer cells stopped having their mass because they were starting to move from what? From a solid into something else. They were starting to not have their cohesiveness, right? And so when we are working with this, with a cellular process, and we understand the mechanism of a cell, then we can better understand more what's actually going on in these other realms. You say, what other realms? Well, let's start at the beginning. What do we know? We know that we have some sort of communication in Scripture that we are an eternal being, right? That we have some semblance of eternal death, eternal life, however you want to equate that in your brain right now is fine, but I can tell you it's probably not what you think it is, okay? And then we have this other premise that there's some sort of finiteness or limitation or shortness of reality for us here on earth as beings. So we can accept that there's a supernatural realm, right, where angels and demons and all kinds of stuff exists, right? We've kind of got that brain going on. Heck, if you go start in the book of Revelations, we know that John was caught up in the spirit, and you rapturists love that stuff, right? But the truth is they have no clue what's actually going on there, and I might have to explain that today. We'll see how it goes. The most important thing to know is that this started with a simple question. I was sitting there and I was having one of those moments that's kind of existential where I'm saying, okay, if what I'm teaching is true so far, then what happened to the God of the Bible, right? Where do we reconcile the two? Because However we work it out, those 66 books in English have some semblance of truth to them. Notice I said some semblance because you cannot translate Hebrew into English. You know why? Because it's a lifestyle, not a language. The entire character set of the Hebrew language is actually a communication of a very specific type of lifestyle, that being the lifestyle of the nomad. And in addition to that, in order to really understand that, you would not be able, you would have to disassociate yourself from your American understanding. You would have to disassociate yourself from your modern world global understanding. That's right. It doesn't necessarily always have to be about Americans in this sense. There's a sentiment present in global understanding that is very similar to an American Christian. But the premise is that when we're working with this, we have to look at this from the point of view of what, we have to look at it from the point of view of purpose, for one, right? Purpose, observation, intent, those are all very important. So earlier when I was telling the story about starting the ministry, there was a point in time where I arrived at a conclusion that the people that were being drawn to the ministry were not only something's not right people. In other words, they were sitting in the pew on Sunday morning going, something doesn't sound right. What is that? That's spiritual knowledge, overriding written knowledge that's being interpreted by what? Experiential knowledge. In other words, a pastor either A, went to Bible school, or he was raised in a church and believes a certain way, believes certain doctrine, believes certain theologies, etc., etc. Covenantal theology, dispensational theology, olive tree theology, etc., etc. Right? So in that premise, then we have to make an adjustment. We have to say, okay, if we have a something's not right people, then that means there's some sort of spiritual communication or unction from another realm telling them that what they're hearing while they're sitting in the pew on Sunday morning is not okay. And so they either A, leave, or they go and they question the pastor. And next thing you know, the pastor is telling the husband to get their wife in order, etc., etc. Yes. No, there are plenty of testimonies within my ministry about those things having happened. So I realize where something's not right ministry, right? We're always questioning, wait a minute, no, that doesn't sound right. Something's not clicking. Something's not okay. The second thing is that basically I realize that we have an actual developed model. And that developed model has two elements to it. The first element is de novo. We pretend like we don't know anything. And then we move in that process of working through something like when we're in Midrash of not knowing. And then we accept the possibility that we may have been unlearned, right? So what? We develop this model. What does it say? It says, we seek the most efficient, effective, and correct path to walk. As we encounter a path, we test it to see whether it actually is legitimate. Does it do what it says it's going to do? Does it act within its purpose the way it has been communicated that it's supposed to, right? And then what? If it doesn't, we throw it out, no matter how sacred it is. It can be a special Christian doctrine that makes your heart feel so good, right? Too bad. And out the door it goes. And in that process, then what? We have a void. Oh, wait a minute. What does that mean? If we have a void, then that means that there is now an opportunity for something to be there. So that void is a space, which is an opportunity for what? For learning, for a lifestyle change that may possibly make you a more effective human being. What did I have to let go of? Dogma. I had to let go of ancestral influence. My parents were Christians, right? My great-grandfather was the great Bible minister of Philadelphia, et cetera, et cetera. I had to let go of those things. We had to let go and say, okay, maybe, because why? That void could be filled with something from another religion that's actually a truth that was thrown out by Augustine and his cohorts. Okay? And now all of a sudden, now Augustinian Christianity has what? Something missing from it, or a void, a space already available to have something put in it. And of course, those little voids in Christianity have been filled with what? Bylaws, commentaries, etc. Okay. So then we have this idea that we replace it with a path that seems to be the correct path for that specific subject, genre, question, etc. And then we put it back through the model. Does it work? Does it exist? Is it right? Do we have confirmation? Have we been shown that it's actually legitimately showing true evidence and it actually works? Okay, fine, it does. Cool. Then I'm going to put it into practice. I'm going to watch it over time. I'm going to put it into practice. I'm going to watch it over time. And I'm going to go, okay, yep, that does actually work. Well, that's interesting because that came out of Islam or that came out of Hinduism. Of course it did, right? Because we know that the intensification of all power in the universe communicated truth to the entire universe. And in that process of communicating truth to the entire universe, it was wrapped up in a bunch of hogwash. And so now we know there's some truth somewhere in something wrapped up in a bunch of hogwash, right? You got to reach into the mess and pull it out of the mess, and there it is. Okay. All right. So the premise is now what we have. We have if it works, right? If we've tested it, we've walked it out, the lifestyle demonstrates that it actually is a reality, then we teach it to others. Why? Because we want others to know how to be more effective, how to be more real, which is why, because we want to see change. We, as a ministry, are so tired of not seeing change, right? Everybody's blaming somebody else and everybody is refusing to take that responsibility, but then they're also what? Expecting somebody else to do it first. Well, there ought to be a law. Oh, really? There ought to be a law? I tell you what, why don't you go sit outside the local grocery store with a table and start a ballot, right? Get something put on the ballot. Get some petitions signed, right? That's what I mean. But here's the premise. That resulted in what? You are the change that this world needs. That's our slogan, as it were. So why after his heart ministries then? What is it? What is it? What is it existing as? It's existing as an opportunity for people to step into their correct purpose, to operate in the power or energy that they've been given, in the authority that they've been given as a corporate collective conscious known as the bride of Christ. We are literally a marriage ministry. We are trying to match. We're doing matchmaking. We are trying to match the bride with the bridegroom. And they both have to have the correct identity and they both have to have the correct understanding of covenant in order to be joined together in order for something that I don't even know what amazing to occur. You know, when we see things in Revelation like the Lamb slain from the foundations of the earth, sitting on the throne, having a scroll in his hand, and only he is able or worthy to open the scroll. Do you know one of the most annoying graphics that I have ever seen is the picture of the Lamb holding the Christian flag? Like, right? Okay. We need to stop with the literalism. Okay. And that's our problem that we are having. We are trying to make a very mystical, intense, energy-based, authority-based religion into what we want it to be based upon an absolutely asinine thought process of interpreting something literally when it is communicated that it is not that. What do I mean? Whenever it says as it were, or whenever it says it was like, that means it wasn't the actual thing. You need to remember that Hebrews at large had a tendency to use what? They had a tendency to use metaphors, allegories, and they had a tendency to use idioms, right? Cliches. We do it all the time as Americans, but we still have this literal mindset. What does that mean? That means there's no throne. There's no lamb. Those are energies of some sort, and there's a process behind them. So let's talk a minute about that thought process. Let's think about what it means to actually have an energy move. What causes energy to move? Some sort of intention. Okay? What is intention? Attention is a sovereign opportunity for something that has free will to direct that energy. Authority. Right? So intention or a throne is what? It's an image or a metaphor or an allegory or an idiom for authority. It makes sense, right? I'm sorry, but there's no solid material thing in which somebody sits upon, and that is the function of authority. Sorry, doesn't work that way. In fact, it violates so many things. It violates so many physical laws, right? Just to even remotely touch upon the possibility that there is a solid there. They say, well, God can do anything. Okay, fine, except for one problem. Paul said we need to look at what was made in order to understand our God. Well, then we have a problem because solids definitely are a lower frequency vibration. But what if there was a possibility that there was actually a solid, a probability of a solid in another world, in another realm? What would it look like? How would it process, et cetera, et cetera? Well, again, we get into the idea of frequencies, but we can't think like Earth, right? We can't think rocks and flowers and all that kind of stuff. Those are teaching us about the upper realms. A tree is teaching us about the upper realms. In fact, it is actually in the shape of how the upper realms emanate down into us, right? Of a bird, a flyer that flies, right? A flyer that flies is idiomatic of something else in another realm. Well, what do we understand? We know that there's this element of attraction, right? We talked about that last week. That if we are on the same, we're on the same harmonic path, as it were, in terms of a charged energy, then we need to agree that that causes us to attract. What it attracts to us, that's a whole nother question. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the premise is that in that process, then now we can understand that there is actually in front of us an idea that we attract things to ourselves based upon the energy that we're moving in. And remember that charge does not have to be positive. It doesn't necessarily have to be a positive energy. As long as we're aligned, we're attracting. Okay. But here's the crazy part. Once you start to get into the harmonic frequencies of those energies polarized, you're attracting other energies with similar vibrations to that process. Meaning what? If you are vibrating with malevolent energies, you are drawing to yourself malevolent energies. It's inevitable that we attract to ourselves what we're actually operating in. We make a bad choice to do something evil, guess who's coming? All the Elohim that are charged with malevolent energies. You say, well, wait a minute, isn't that God's? No, that's your word. That's not the Hebrew's word. And see, again, we're losing touch with an understanding because we're trying to just make God one singular entity at the end all, but you don't even understand that. Like the intensification of all power in the universe is not something I can describe, not something I can assign a gender to, not something I can explain in terms of human terms without dumbing it down. Okay? I have to use drawings of shapes that are ours. They're anthropomorphic shapes. In other words, there's a shape that's out there that's not something we understand. Okay? And the problem is that we're arrogant and prideful and stubborn and fearful enough to try to force it to be a shape that we understand. Trying to stuff God into a box. Well, why is this so important? Because we need to remember that there is only one level of intensification of all power in the universe. That's 100% light, and there nothing else can exist. And just dialing back that 1% light, creating the 99% light creates an Elohim, and that Elohim has sovereignty over every other Elohim below it. But at the same time, you need to understand that there is never, ever a actual communication between the intensification of all power in the universe and that Elohim. Why? Because that Elohim can never send anything out to the intensification of all power in the universe. It can only receive, and only through a contraction is there actually a benevolent energy that moves downward into the other concentric contractions. Why is it so important? Well, in its simplicity, what that means is until that first contraction, there is no perceivable God. Because we can't put anything, at the moment that we say the word God, the moment that we think about it, we put limitations on it. Because we need what? Frames of reference. This is how humans operate. We need frames of reference. We need to distort and generalize information. And not only that, but if we have some form of future, we still need prior frames of reference. You need to create constructs. You can't just think up something new. You have to use the shapes that you know. You have to use the colors that you know. And all of those things are finite. They're only here in this 1% light, 99% darkness place. And here's the crazy part about it. We have the nerve to think that we are important, or the nerve to think that we have any function of knowledge, right? I love the illustration. I think I got it from, I either got it from Hank Hanegraaff, or I got it from Josh McDowell, or I got it from Lee Strobel. But he says, draw a circle on a piece of paper. Let that represent all the knowledge in the universe. Now draw a circle that represents your knowledge. Is it possible that maybe there's some things you don't know, right? That's the exercise. Well, there's an effectiveness to understanding that if that's true, then maybe we shouldn't be so adamant about assigning malevolent accusations to others who don't agree with the way you think, believe, or operate. I'm not trying to say that we need to make a universal religion. What I'm saying is there is a right path that's partially based upon your experience. What does that mean? My God is not your God. That means that my personal experiential knowledge and process within that function of the intensification of all power in the universe, the filters are not your filters. You do not understand God the way I do. And I don't understand God the way you do. And we can't explain it to each other. Why? Because we are a fingerprint in the universe. We are unique. We have actually been created as the result of a very unique process by which there is such free will that not one of us is the same ever in the history of the existence of humanity. Not one. There has never been a duplicated fingerprint, to my knowledge anyways. Okay, so if that's the case, and we are an Elohim, then technically speaking, there are a million, billion, trillion different possibilities on how God is going to exist, right? Because remember, an Elohim contains all of the information, all of the power, all of the authority as the same existence as the intensification of all power in the universe, but dummied down, transformed down, diminished into what we are today, okay? Which is a long, drawn-out process. 100% light down to down to 1% light. And we think we're something special. We think because we've kind of figured all these things out. But nobody's ever even remotely touched on the possibility that until this Earth, this entire globe comes together as a singularity of Elohim as the bride, that it's very possible that we're going to be stuck in a loop of information, which I'll explain information in a minute, in a loop of information that we continue to relive over and over and over again through the generations, through our ancestors, etc., etc. All our DNA contains all of the history and information of the entire world and its experience, right? We have a legitimate assignment of a bottleneck of humanity in which it was reduced down to a few pieces of information that is almost indicative, depending on creation scientist opinion versus evolutionist opinion, that says that only 8 people existed at one point in time. Obviously, a confirmation on the flood, but we've got to be stubborn. We've got to say, oh, but the Bible contradicts itself here. Oh, but this word means this. Oh, but this, when the truth is that we need to realize that the word of God is actually just an energy. I'm going to prove it to you. So now, the way that I want you to think about this is that experiential knowledge is you uniquely experiencing the spiritual unctions of reaction to the information being input into your sensory perceptions that's different for every single human being. Meaning what? There's no one single interpretation of Scripture. There's no one single right path, because your path is different from my path. You want proof? You don't do what I do. You do not know what I know. You don't actually work with wood the way I work with wood. You probably work with it better. Or perhaps maybe you work with computers, which you probably don't do better than me. But the point is that there is a function here of idea that there's a uniqueness, and there's weaknesses here and strengths here, and there's holes in the knowledge here, and there's answers to that knowledge there. It's unique. Why is that so important? Because when we get into dogma and religion and functional organization of control over people's using spiritual influence, or what we would call a lack of spirituality, we start to understand how it can cause us to err so severely in our process of information that's being offered to us. Paul said, pay attention to that which has been made, and I have used the menstrual period, I have used flowers, I've used rocks, I've used grass, I've used the rainbow, I've used rain, I've used water, I've used all these things to learn about the intensification of all power in the universe, but also how those natural order processes occur in the other realms. So now what we need to talk about is cost, okay? So to do that, what I want to do is I want to go ahead and shift over to the board, because I think I've made my argument. Okay. So let's see. I guess we need some brown here. Actually, you know what? Let's do this. That one, that's the best I can do on brown. I really need a better, I need more colors someday, but okay. Okay, and we'll do, let's see, we'll use this one for labeling. We'll go ahead and use that and that. I always pick my colors while I'm teaching you guys, and the reason I do that is because I feel like sometimes that is an unction in and of itself. What colors do you need at that moment? Okay, So here we go. Let's start at the beginning. We got this picture, right? There's the picture, and here's a little handle, right? And then over here, we've got this little cup. And let's say that we have just a smidge of liquid in the bottom of the cup. And we have a full pitcher. Let's put the water here. Okay. And so what do we understand? The full pitcher is what? Let's start labeling this stuff. Let's label this first. What's in the pitcher itself? Energy of some sort. Stop being scared of the word new age. You are in a new age. In fact, you were brought into a new age at the moment that you began to actually question your existence in the church. If you're not questioning your existence in the church, then you're probably not in the new age yet. What do I mean by that? I mean that the church has done a fair share of having its age, and it's time to move out of the quote unquote church, which is not, understand, I'm not saying we need to leave our venues, or that we need to leave our religion, or that we need to leave our doctrine. You just need to check it, right? Okay, so that's energy. So our water representation equates to energy. And what is the pitcher? The pitcher is the greater. Remember our greater and lesser thought process. Okay, what else do we have? We have fullness, right? Fullness. And what do we have here? We have increase. And we have, so that's going to be increase. And we have decrease and lack. Okay, what else do we have? We have, oops. Let's just come off of this same line here. We have life. We have death. Okay. Okay. So what do we got here? We also have potential. And we have knowledge. Okay, why is this so important? Because knowledge equates to information or, for lack of better words, substance that can be horrible. Can be communicated. Goodness. It's hard to write down here. Communicated. Okay. Thank you for the weakness of not being able to spell. All right. So now in that, what is potential then? It is ignorance. That's mixed up. Ignorance. Or being unlearned. You say somebody who's unlearned is dead? Yep. Definitely unlearned. Okay, let's see if I can get this just a little bit better penmanship here. Unlearned. Okay. All right. And so no information is present. There's a potential here. Fullness contains all of the information, all of the authority, all of the energy necessary for what? For this to end. For death, decrease, and lack to end. Okay, So now let's talk about what we have going on here. In this first part, which is going to be what we'll call the first principle, okay? In the first principle, a vessel is created. Oh, yeah, let me label this guy. A vessel is created with potential to receive. What does that mean? It's ignorant of everything. Okay? Anything it does contain is all it knows. Okay? So a vessel is a potential to receive. Okay. Now, in that process of reception, there is a necessity for there to be something present. What needs to be present? Well, let's draw one more line off of that dot, and we will call it void. Okay? We will call it void. A void has to be present in order for a vessel to exist. Okay? In other words, a vessel that is full has no need for there to be any more filling. That's going to be important in my next point. But the thing you need to think about is what needs to happen now is powerful, because what's going to happen here? Well, what we're going to do, I don't think I actually have the ability to copy information here. I don't know. Let me try. See if I can actually drag and drop this onto another page. Nope, I can't. Okay. Always learning new things with this, always learning the limitations, as it were, of this whole program. Okay. So now that's going to be first principle. And I'm going to go ahead and frame it. Okay. I'm going to frame it so that it is an illustration that's separate from the rest of the illustrations. Let's see. We need 2D. We'll just do a rectangle here. There is the first principle, okay? So now what we need to do is we need to draw the second principle. And because I kind of want them all on the same page, I'm going to draw a little bit smaller. So I apologize for those of you who are on your phone. You can take it home later and cast it to your TV and watch it or whatever, okay? So let's see. We need our picture. That's not our picture. We need our picture, right? So we have our picture here. But what I want to do is illustrate the concept or the process here of pouring, okay? So what we're going to do is we're just going to kind of send the essence out of here, which means what? There is a reduction, okay? So we're going to call this a reduction. Okay, there's a reduction, and then there's a what? There's an increase. Right? There's an increase, which means what? There is an elevation. What is this action here? This is the second principle. And within that second principle, we start to get into cost, which I'll explain here in a minute. But within the second principle, we have increase, we have reduction, or you could even call it decrease in a weird sort of way. Decrease. Well, but here's the issue. Even though that decrease is occurring, this is a greater vessel, right? This is a greater. Let's label him. This is the greater. This is the lesser. That's always going to be true, except in one instance, which I may or may not get to today. But what do we know? There is a cost to giving that energy. Remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Energy transferred results in a cost. Let me give you an example real quick. Remember when the lady with the issue of blood, which is, I don't know. When we stop using King James language, it's going to be beautiful, but that's not this generation. So there's this woman with the issue of blood. 12 years she has this bleeding issue, which makes her what? Unclean, needing to be outside the camp, etc., etc., etc. She exhausted herself with physicians, which we could go into what that meant back then, but let's not. Either way, she is not able to actually have a legitimate relief from her ailment or her dis-ease, right? Her discomfort. So she somehow formulates, there's plenty of speculation from the Messianic community, the Torah observant community, that she knew the scripture, there would be healing in its wings. Problem is that was a S-U-N, son, Shemesh, not S-O-N, then. Okay? So we could get into all kinds of weird stuff about that, but let's just go with she had this idea in her head that if she touched the hem of his garment, that she would be healed. Yeshua's in this huge crowd. God knows why. Had to have been a feast day or something. And he's like pushed on every side. I've never really been in that kind of a circumstance where I'm like pushed on every side, but I've definitely been in large groups of people where it was hard to walk through a group of people and you're like, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, excuse me, right? So they're all touching him, right? And then what? He is touched by this woman and he says, who touched me? Why did he say that? Because he identified a cost. He's like, energy moved. Energy moved, and because that energy moved, I'm aware that somebody touched me. The disciple's like, hey, dude, come on, everybody's touching you. He's like, no, somebody in this crowd is the lesser and received my energy. Right? Somebody received, therefore I gave, and therefore I'm the greater, she's the lesser, she's elevated, I am what? Reduced. Now, let me show you something. Does the picture ever equal? Is there an equality here? Answer, no. Let me remind you, there are three types of entities in your life. There is your teacher or a lesson or information that you don't have being conveyed. There's a contemporary, which is either your shield bearer or you are their shield bearer, but they are designed to elevate each other. Is there a greater and lesser there? Kind of, yes, but not on the level of the teacher, okay? Not on the level of the lesson or the information gathering. Then there is what? The student, the vessel of reception, the one who receives the information, the learning, the change, right? And so we have change agents, we have contemporaries to help along the way of change, and we have those who need to change. She needed to change. She needed to receive a very different process by which she would not have dis-ease and she would not have discomfort. Okay, so why is it so important? Because you need to understand that there's never an equality between the greater and the lesser. Okay, so when it says something is a lesser vessel, that is it. That in that case, in that function, there is no change or difference. Why? Because the greater has to always be higher in what? energy, authority, and purpose. Okay, let me go ahead and show you that so you can look at them. Higher in energy, authority, and purpose. Energy, authority, and purpose. Okay. And the lesser has to be lower in those things in order for there to be a transference of energy. Now you say, well, why is that even important? Why should there ever be a transfer of energy? Because there's a necessity for what? Elevation. This increase is actually elevation. The second principle is elevation. Okay? That's going to be very, very important here in a little bit. Now, elevation, interestingly enough, has two principles to it. A is when there is a cost to the greater to raise the status. This is important right here. These levels right here. In fact, I'm going to put them in a different color. I've been doing a lot of green here. I think what I'm going to do is we're going to go ahead and put this in yellow because it is a label that is very, very important. Okay. What are these? States. Okay. This is status, which is what? Identity. Okay. Identity. So why is this important? Because as it stands right here, this vessel could never attain to this vessel. We know that's true because of the 99% light and the 1% darkness that will never attain to the 100% light, because then it would just be the greater and there would be no lesser. There would be no vessel to pour into. What actually is being poured into? Well, now we need to ask John that question, right? So what is John, the guy who wrote the letters of John? What does he say? He says, God is love. Well, love in American understanding, which is a westernized Greek bastardization of the reality of what love is in a Hebraic understanding, is very important. Why do I say a bastardization? Because there's actually this subculture creation of love that has nothing to do with what a Hebrew's understanding of love is. But it definitely all originates from what? From the Sumerian Empire, from the Egyptian Empire, from the Mesopotamian area, right? From the Northern Africa area, all have this same similar concept of love being hospitality or providing a space. And that's going to be very, very powerful and important today. We're going to get to that. But here's the premise. The premise is that there's always a greater than you, and there's always a lesser than you, and there's always a contemporary. That is just standard process of reality for you. Okay? That means that you can eliminate one of those from your lifestyle and have an effective or an enjoyable life. Oh, we understand the first and second principles here. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to square that down and see if we can't use this bottom area here. Okay. And so well, let's just see if I can get away with this without a big old mess. Probably can't, but we'll try. Oh, maybe I got it. Oh, goodness, no. Okay, there we go. All right, so let me go ahead and park this over here. Oh, no, I do have to have it within that context. Okay. Let me park that right there, and we will draw another square around it as the second principle, and we'll color that just something different, right? Second principle. There you go. All right. So what's the second principle? Elevation. Well, let's talk a minute about elevation. It has two processes to it. Number one is there's a necessity for a greater to what? To get underneath a lesser and raise them up into a new position or status. Now, this can get really, really powerful because in the end, when we have this greater elevating this lesser, one of the things that we need to understand is that requires the greater to have the status of greater. Enter the lesser. The lesser actually defines the greater. Let me explain. Let's say you're in the military. You have a general. The general has command over a whole bunch of people. Can't remember how many, but that's irrelevant. General has command over all these different military entities, right? But really, what is his command? Is an acknowledgement from his subordinates that he's the boss. And if there's ever a given time where the subordinates decide not to allow him to be boss anymore, it doesn't matter what his rank is. It doesn't matter what he was assigned. Doesn't matter what authority was delegated to him. He's not general. In other words, the identity of the greater is contingent upon the belief from the lesser that they are a greater. Meaning what? The lesser has to believe that it is a vessel of reception. The lesser has to believe that they are a lesser, not the greater, right? Ooh, boy, we're getting into some heavy stuff now, especially if we start to get into where we find the term lesser vessel in Scripture. Okay, so now, let's see what we're going to do here. We're going to explain cost real quick. Okay, let's go over here. So real quick, I'm just going to kind of blow this up real quick here. Oops. Real quick, I'm going to blow this up. Nope, that's not it. Blow this up, showing just this diagram, because what I need to do is I need to label something very, very important. And that is this concept right here. Cost. Why is it so important? Because cost is basically what's going to happen to the greater when they give, when there is benevolence, okay? Something is going to happen to the greater, because remember, in our first illustration, right? In our first illustration, what do we have? Right? We have something very, very important here. Okay. Let's see if I can get this to move up. Okay, I kind of can get it to move up. I don't know if I'm going to get it to move up any more than this. Let's see. No? Okay. Let me zoom this back out here. And so what we have now is we have some very disconcerting elements. Let's go ahead and put them in, let's put them in that color. That a lack of energy, a lack of authority, and a lack of information or purpose is death. Who remembers this? Who remembers the teaching where I taught death is actually an empty stomach? That death is not the expiration of the body. That when Yahweh said to Adam, you will die, he meant there's going to be a void in you, right? And in that principle, as he eats the fruit, we see that void. We see that moment where he hides himself from Yahweh. There's some sort of deficit to the relationship now. I'm not going to get into that. But the premise is that death is not ever been in a Hebrew's mind the expiration of the body. Now, Are there places where it says that such and such died? Some, but generally speaking, it's an idiom that says they were gathered to their people or they were gathered to their fathers, right? Death itself is not necessarily communicated. Oftentimes it says something like they gave up the ghost. Still, not the expiration of the body per se. I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. That's more the expiration of the body than the word death. Why do we put it there? Because the word death in English means the expiration of the body. But have you ever had like a vision or a dream, and as you started to kind of create it, let's say that you started a business and it's not successful, and somebody's like, "Oh, hey, how's your business going?" And you're like, "It's stagnant. There's no income. There's no capital, right?" We idiomatically use the word death. Okay, so now getting back into that process, what information do we now know? We now know in premise that the second principle or cost is actually a death. A death. So now let's talk about the Hebraic understanding of death. You have this premise of a person going into the grave and becoming diminished in vital essence, right? And then we have this idea of there being a raising in newness of life and a resurrection. That's our baptism, right, in Christianity. But the premise is that there's this thing happening. Now, Paul, thank you, Paul, again, for that infinite wisdom that he communicated in this. He says, what shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Most certainly not. For how shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Whoa, died. Ooh, using the death concept here. Died to sin. Is he using the lack and decrease? No. He's using the decreation of the body, right? So now we're back into that kind of that Greek moment where that's not how he probably would have said it in the Hebrew. And people who have the nerve to think that he wrote these letters in Greek have another thing coming. But the premise is that basically in the Hebrew, he would have communicated the expiration of the body, not lack and decrease. Because why? He says how that we have died to it, that it is what? It no longer has its power. Let's prove it. He says, or do you not know that when you were baptized into Christ, you were baptized into his death? Right? And then paraphrasing it, what did it say? He says, when you came up out of the water, you were baptized into his resurrection. And if you got the resurrection within you, right? Then not only does that equate to you being a son of God, right? But also gives you the concept or the idea that you are not in the flesh, that the ego doesn't have power over you. You are no longer slave to sin, which is what? We'll get to that. Okay, so the premise is that now when we're talking about elevation and cost, what we are talking about is that there's a death. Okay, there's this moment of absolute emptiness from what? Energy, authority, and purpose. You say, well, that doesn't make any sense. Because where do we get the idea or the premise? This is going to be funny. I'm actually going to be swatting at a mosquito on camera. Okay, so where do we get the premise or the idea that there is a function of death within the cost? Have you ever been at like a party or at a friend's house or something like that and end up in a conflict and leave that place so drained that the next day you sleep all day? That was cost. You gave energy to that circumstance or situation, either in a state of positive energy or in a state of molecular energy, depending on if you blew up on them or whatever, but you lost energy. Now, is there more energy coming for you? Yes, of course. Is that energy available to you right now? Yes, that also is true, but you have to move it with your intention and observation. That's a whole nother discussion. But the premise is that that draining feels like what? Absolute fatigue, exhaustion. Ugh, right? Welcome to death. Okay. Now, when we're dealing with the function of adenosine triphosphate as an energy, we need to understand that that is what has been made, formed. Okay. Let me illustrate for you real quick before we get into this next principle, which is going to be the third principle of Elohim. All right. So let's go here. And what are we working with here? We're going to go with, how do I do this? All right, I'm going to shoot from the hip here. It's been a while since I've messed with this, but we're just going to kind of go with this. This is a cell, okay? And within this cell is this little area right here. And what's interesting is that it has these little gear mechanisms, okay? And let's see if I can get away with this because this is going to be crazy if I can do this. Let's draw them like this. Actually, you know what? I'm going to do it differently. I just realized this needs to be illustrated differently. So let's let green represent that. Okay, so sorry, for a moment, I am having kind of a brain fart on how to illustrate this for you, but that's going to be fine here. Okay, so then we have these things. And actually, well, let's just go the whole entire length. And they have these grooves in them. Okay. And there's kind of a little axle. Okay, and so here's how it works. Something comes into the cell, which we know as glucose. The way it gets in is basically there's a key that unlocks the door, and that's insulin. The glucose goes into the cell, and what the cell does is takes the glucose and strips it down into these little pieces, but eventually what it actually is using after it pulls all the other elements off of it, and let's just kind of put this pipe thing right here. Actually, no, I need to illustrate that in a different color. So there's kind of this little pipe thing. Oh, goodness. Sometimes I really got to find out if I can get another program here. Okay, so there's this little pipe thing. And what happens is this adenosine triphosphate has all of its hydrogen stripped off of it. So I'm just gonna draw these. Oh my gosh, this thing. I'm gonna draw these little H's. Okay. And what happens is they transfer onto this thing. Okay. And as they're pushed in through pressure or through current, we should call it, this little thing spins. Well, that little thing is actually the mechanism that contains the information for the cell to actually divide. Okay. So as the glucose comes in, then the hydrogen, right, is stripped off of it. Let's just put a package here with the H's coming out one side and the ATP going into other. Okay, and then adenosine triphosphate going into other. And so now there's this process in which there is actually one cycle or oscillation of the cell. And in that cycle or oscillation where this thing literally spins, Okay. Don't think that I am indicating here that this is some sort of biochemical process. This is mechanical. Okay. That's important for you to know. This is absolutely mechanical. This spins. Okay. And when it does, that's when the cell actually does what a cell is supposed to do or has its purpose. Okay. And so the premise is that when that occurs, now all of a sudden there is within that whole process the creation of what? A new cell. Okay. Now, what does that mean? That means that there needs to be room or space for that new cell. If there's not space, let me explain this. If there is not space in that new cell, it will begin to intrude upon other cellular um, processes. So, for example, let's say that it is a skin cell. If it actually starts to expand without space, it will become what is known as what? A tumor. Okay. You see, so when we talk about adenosine triphosphate as being the energy of life, which is basically glucose or the glucolysis process in which a piece of glucose is stripped down, some elements are added to it, and then that's converted into what would eventually become the electron transfer chain for to spin this little mechanical thing that tells the cell to divide, right? Which is what? Life has nothing to do with life and death. But what can we learn from the energy of life? We can learn that if that energy is not present, that cell can't have its purpose. We learn that if that cell doesn't check first to see if there's space, then it is going to invade someone else's space, which is what means that it's cancer, right? If that cell eats and the other cells don't eat, that's cancer. If that cell replicates itself instead of following the instructions of DNA that tell that cell to do what it's supposed to do in the first place, that's cancer. Why is that so important? Because we can see from the natural order processes of existence in this world of formation. Remember, and God formed Adam from the dust of the ground, breathed what? A breath into his nostrils, and he became a living being, right? Okay. Now I know that's not what it says in the Hebrew, and I know I've already taught you about that. But I'm making a point here that the concept or the idea is that this is not the supernatural realm. That is not the realm in which we actually exist. This is the realm in which we have emanated into a lesser or into a solid. We'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so now here is the premise. If there's no glucose available, then there's no adenosine triphosphate, and a cell is not able to oscillate, it does the opposite. Do you know what it does? It dies. You can research that more by studying mitochondrial DNA. You can study and try to understand some of the other diseases that are related to mitochondrial DNA. So why is this so important? Well, first of all, what needs to be present? Space in order for the cell. Remember, Paul says, go look at what we didn't have microscopes back then, but he says, go look at what's been made to understand your God, right? Okay. So what we need to do is go back to the board and we need to look at this idea of space. Because obviously the first thing that we have is we have this concept or this principle of, and let's see if I can get away with this. The greater. What's going on with the greater as they transfer that energy, that authority, that purpose, that whatever into the lesser? A cost. right? A cost, a great cost. Okay. And what is that great cost? That there would be an absence of energy, authority, and purpose. Now, does that equate to the vessel, the greater vessel, ever equaling the lesser vessel? No. Why? Because there's one more piece in this that needs to be understood, and that is that when it was full, all of the possible information that could be contained in the learning experience exists. Okay. In fact, I'm going to illustrate that in purple. From now on, let's say that purple is going to be our information, and I'll try to make it thick so that it's not lost. So we'll leave that with my finger. Boom, 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 boom. We'll go ahead and label it as what? As information. Information. Has been communicated. Substance of communication has occurred with the greater, which means what? The greater can be reduced below the capacity of the lesser and still be the greater because of identity. Information has already been communicated to the greater. When it was at its fullness, it was at its fullest potential, right? But when you exceed your potential, you move. Okay. And I'm going to explain that in a minute. But first, what we need to do is we need to get to the concept or idea of identity in this sense of information. Information is knowledge. Now, remember, we have written information, which is historical, you know, well, how do I want to call this? Historical, agadic, right? It can be stories, folklore. It can be actual scientific papers written on discoveries and recreation in a laboratory of a specific process, how bacteria react to this kind of yogurt, this kind of yogurt, et cetera, right? How sound reacts to this kind of music. Those are all studies and information that's written versus your actual experience as you encounter this world based upon your perceptions and your frames of reference in which you what? Delete, distort, and generalize the information coming at you, and you package it into things or packets that can then be placed on your timeline as memory peptides. Memory being context sensitive, which means same frequencies, same frequency and same other elements you have to trigger it. Same modalities, same meta information needs to be present to trigger it. So let's say that you go and let's say that you go to lunch, right? You're in high school. You go to lunch, and during lunch, you consume an extraordinary amount of caffeine, say like 5 Mountain Dews, right? Now you go to math class, right? You go through math class, you learn math, then you calm down and you go to your other classes. And then you go to lunch, and one day you decide not to drink the Mountain Dews. And so now you go back into math class, and they pop quiz, and boom, he throws a paper down, and you're supposed to bring up from memory what you have learned. You can't unless that caffeine's present. That's how context sensitive memory is, okay? But in terms of the world of energy, that's frequency. In terms of the world of energy, that's a condition and a state, okay? Condition being basically kind of a state that can be changed, okay? So in that whole process, then what we understand is that information about the vessel being the greater has come from two sources. Number one, from the lesser acknowledging the greater. That's because He threw it out, proving that the lesser received, and therefore it's now realized that it is a giver, and not only that, but that it has more than what is necessary for that current vessel in its current state. Okay. Why is that so important? Because of principle number 3, which we're going to get to in a minute. So what does that mean? That means that the vessel of benevolence, or the vessel that's giving, or the greater, is what? Identifying with the fact that they are greater, but also understands the potential of how full it can be. However, what's really important is that unless that information changes, that's where it will stay. Okay? One more principle that has to be present, and that is that there is always a greater, which means what? There's a bigger one than this one that's going to pour into this one because of the emptiness, because of the void, because of the death, because of the lack and decrease, because of the empty stomach. Okay? So a greater will pour into the greater, and the greater can pour into a lesser. So what does that make that middle greater? A lesser and a greater. Okay? So now we understand where those contractions occur, right? Where that energy transfer occurs that we've been talking about concerning Elohim. This is an Elohim, but this also is an Elohim. Let me see. If I can, let's see, we need to be in this mode. So let's do it this way. This is an Elohim, and that is an Elohim, okay? Which means what? There's another Elohim, which I'll draw just briefly here, to pour into that one, okay? And etc., etc., etc. So when we are working with this diagram, when we're working with this information, you need to understand there's an infinite up and there's an infinite down. Well, there's a limitation to the infinite down, because obviously we get down to the 100% darkness and there's nothing to pour into, right? There's no other concentrism occurring. There's no other vessel of reception present. Okay? So now what we need to understand is the difference between we need to understand what then is occurring in this cost. Remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Remember, that is a rule in the world of formation. But remember, Paul said, look at what has been made to understand our God. And so he says, look, they're without excuse because they can study it. They can learn it and understand it. So now we look again to nature to help us understand. And what do we have? We have these massive, calculatable places where there is a loss of light. There is actually light disappearing, some sort of gravitational anomaly that's pulling the light in, which we've labeled a black hole. So then what we understand then is there's something that can take light away. So if we accept that we are the light, right, which is what? The Elohim of us. We understand that light is what? It is the order of disorder, but we also understand that it is the strong mind versus the twisted head, right? And so it's a very different kind of human being. But then also we understand that light is some sort of energy. And so now we can add to our list that the information present in the vessels is light. Therefore, light is actually information. Light is actual learning. But at the same time, we need to understand that information is interpreted by us through those biases, deleting, distorting, and generalizing. Now, why is that so important? Because now we can get our minds wrapped around, if there's a cost, then there's a necessity for there to be what? There's a necessity for there to be a receiving from a greater entity. I'm going to explain that in a minute after we get to the third principle of Elohim. Okay. So let's make a space for that next piece of information. And like I said, I know it's getting smaller and smaller. Don't worry, you can go throw it up on your flat screen. And besides that, I'm going to be expanding and contracting the image as we go. Okay, so we need to look to the world of nature to understand better what happens when an Elohim is has reached its potential. Okay? Now, there are a number of things that go into this, but the premise is that in general, the only way you can fill something is if it has an area of potential for that filling. In other words, a full glass of water is not going to receive any more water, and the water is going to flow over the edges, right? It's going to overflow, which means it's exceeded its potential. We need a bigger glass. Well, here's the problem. That glass is an entity. It's Elohim. It is a being that has learned its potential. It has understood that it is supposed to hold water, and it is serving its purpose. We know that. Because remember, the entire universe is accepting its purpose. That glass is actually made of molecules that do not have to stay together if they didn't want to. They're choosing to stay together in order to fulfill purpose. You say, that's some crazy stuff. Well, if everything is an Elohim and everything contains that vital essence of the Elohim, just dumbed down, then we accept that that glass actually knows that it's a glass. And it has that information. Now, can it do anything other than that? Can it think? No. But it has enough information to know that it has been shaped into that shape and it is to serve that purpose. And so in that way, it has exceeded its potential when it is full. And if it exceeds its potential, then we need what? Another glass. But the problem is we start filling another glass, we've neglected that glass. We've neglected that Elohim. Enter nature to teach us what happens when there is no space. Does the glass shatter when we pour water into it? No. What does the glass do? It just sits there. Something needs to tell that glass to change the composition. Okay. Now, in our reality, that's not a reality, right? You can't tell a glass to just change its composition and now all of a sudden it can receive more water. Become a pitcher, right? Let's try it. Become a pitcher. So what does that mean? This is learning. This is information for us as Elohim to understand how things function. However, we're not going to ask the glass. Why? Because it's a solid. It's vibrating at a lower frequency. So let's ask something that vibrates at a higher frequency. How about the most superior species on the face of the planet? How about we ask a human? What happens when there's no space? Well, let's take a look. So going back to our cellular process again, we remember that once the adenosine triphosphate makes one cycle through the electron transfer chain generator thingy, now all of a sudden we have two cells. Well, by the 8th generation, we have 2,048 cells. Okay, 2,048 cells. Now, why is that important? Well, because when we're dealing with this, we need to understand that it has got a lot more dividing to go. But 2,048 cells in a space where there is no space means a space needs to be created. Enter the womb, right? So what does the womb do? It expands. It contains, but it expands, right? And as it expands over time, over a 10-week a 40-week gestation, we are dealing with the function of a human being made in that process. It is occurring. Now, why is that important? Because now we understand that there's a necessity for what? Expansion. There's a need to be able to stretch. Now, can this stretch? No, because it's vibrating at such a low frequency, right? That's just how it is. What you guys don't know is that this is actually fluid. This glass is actually fluid. It's a liquefied version um, of over time, you can actually, if you find old glass, you can actually find where it's actually flowed down and become thicker at the bottom than at the top. And there's a thinness to the top and there's a thickness to the bottom. And you can actually see where there's kind of drops rolling down. That's hundreds of years for that to occur. You can find that in old buildings too, with old window panes. Okay, so the premise is that as much as it is a solid is actually a liquid, but the premise is that it's vibrating at such a low frequency that it's a solid force. So again, we ask the human, what happens next? Well, in its simplicity, there needs to be a conception and then right? Also what? There's that releasing, there's that time of pouring out and giving the existence of a new vessel, right? Essentially, if you give birth to a female, right? Now we are working with the same principle of a greater and a lesser, and that is still fillable, and this is still fillable, right? Now, obviously, we would need to allow maturation to occur, but the premise is the potential for that vessel to receive is already present. Okay. That means our third principle that we need to work with here is going to be expansion. Okay, so let's jump over here. All right, so we have, let's see, I labeled that in yellow. Expansion. How does it work? Well, the first thing that you need to know is that when a vessel is in its purpose, it cannot see anything else. Okay. So here is a vessel operating in its purpose, knows that it can pour out, right? Has never gotten to fullness, but knows that it can pour out. So if there is a lesser present somewhere, it can definitely give to that lesser, right? But has never actually gotten to the top here in that process. Once that vessel, so what does that mean? That means the only information that that vessel understands is here. Okay? Which is what? Its identity, right? That's its identity. So in principle, then let's label it this way, that this is identity. What it is. And we could even put this as who am I? Who am I? Right? Okay. So in that whole function, then what we need to accept is that the who am I is important in the sense of, is important in the sense of understanding identity. Okay. That information was only gained as more energy, authority, and purpose are made manifest or are made known. A vessel with just that much only knows that much. A vessel with this much only knows that much, and a vessel with this much has what? Exceeded its potential. Why? Because this point between here and here on both of these entities, actually, you know what, let's color it a different color. between here and here and here and here is what? What do these two have in common but potential? Potential. Potential. Right? Potential. The opportunity to gain more information and the opportunity to become greater in purpose and greater in authority and greater in energy. Okay? Remember, the energy we're talking about is the energy that was present in Yeshua. And if you think for a second, let me share something with you. The power that went out of him was only present in him. You're going to stay a lesser for the rest of it. You will always be the one to receive the energy, and you'll never believe that it's energy. And not only will you never believe it's energy, but you'll probably be one of those people who's a scaredy cat of it. So you need to understand when Yeshua said, let me just make a point real quick. Yeshua said, greater things will you do than. Well, let me blow your mind. Yeshua was always tempted and did not sin. Sin is a violation of Torah. If you show me where you went to a point where you actually did not violate Torah, and you show me when he says, right, when he speaks of sin, Yeshua, in the narratives, which Augustine Christianity is called the Gospels, we need to understand that he said sin is a violation of Torah, and said that if you violate it, or you teach somebody to violate, you'll be called least in the kingdom of heaven. You'll be called a lesser. So don't take my word for it, take Yeshua's word for it. But the energy that went out of him is present in you as well. Okay? So in that principle, then, as we gain more information, right? Remember, the purple is information. And look, the purple is information even in the vessel of reception. The vessel of reception is learning I can be filled, and is learning I actually can become more filled than I was. And maybe even learns of the void, which would be shadow work. This right here would be shadow work, which is what? Acceptance. I have more to go. I am an imperfect being. I'm not always going to get it right because I don't know everything. I don't have the power, authority, or purpose that the greater vessel has. Okay? Remember, these are Elohim we're talking about here. All right? These are Elohim. So now what's important to understand is in that process of expansion, what's going to happen is there's going to be a moment in time where the greater is actually going to have something happen. And let's see if I can get away with this right here. Perfect. Okay. So what's going to happen? The greater is actually going to have this time in which there's a stretching. Okay. And that stretching is going to create what? More potential, right? More potential, but also what? More death. Until life is given from a greater. Because remember, this vessel is not the greatest. It's just a greater. Okay. And what's important about that is in that there is within that death something going on. Because when we look back to the cycle of Israel, something very powerful is happening. Right? Let's talk about this just for a moment. You guys remember this diagram, cycle of Israel. We got winter, right? We've got spring. We've got summer. We've got fall. We've got what? Death, resurrection. We've got maturation. Remember the maturation of the smaller vessel? The daughter being born has to grow up before she can actually be a vessel of reception. Maturation. And then we've got what? Entropy. The breaking down of things. And in that process, what do we have? We have the movement from obedience to disobedience. Right? And in that disobedience, somewhere between here and here is an infestation of malevolent energies. And then there is what? There is an oppression that occurs at this point right here. Okay. And then what? Right here, about this point right here, there's a possession. Remember, this was the idea of, hey, let's go after other gods. Oh, since you are actually different than us and not actually a part of us, we're going to subject you to slavery and take away your weapons and do all kinds of other things. And when that happens, we're going to actually own you, which consequently, if it's a pagan nation, they are in control. They are under the control of an extremely strong malevolent energy called what? A demon, right? Which is a light sucker or a black hole that removes benevolent energies before they ever arrive at the person who's supposed to receive them. And they have jurisdiction, they have authority, they've been given that. Remember, they go to Yeshua and say, you are here early, right? You're not supposed to be here yet. I still have a contract. And that results in what? That results in a crying out, crying out, cry out. And so what do we know? We know that decrease is present here. And that increase is present here. And in the season of fatness, we are experiencing, in the season of fatness, we are experiencing a forgetting of our hungers. Right? As satiety comes, we forget that we were hungry. We forget that we fasted. We forget. And the crying out occurs. We have to die in order to experience the power of resurrection. And during that crying out, there's a strong deliverance that will always be the result of the actual party themselves delivering themselves. Remember, the cycle of Israel says that the Israelites would be oppressed by the nation that infested them in the first place with their pagan practices of child sacrifice, child exploitation, exploitation of women, and human sacrifice in general, the violent, destructive slaughtering of animals in order to satiate gods, right? And we know that in Christianity, specifically Augustine and Marcion accused the Old Testament God of needing to be satiated by blood, which is where we have this total misnomer and understanding of what a sacrifice actually is and what Yeshua actually did for us. Anyways, so the premise is that now we have this nation, this pagan nation who practices these social injustices, influencing this nation who's been commanded by the intensification of all power in the universe to what? To have social justice. And in that process of social justice, experience benevolence and therefore have a reciprocation of benevolence, which is what? Being the head and not the tail. Blessed will be your kneading bowls, etc., etc. Deuteronomy 28, 1 through 14. So now it's very important that when we're working with that information, we accept that this pagan nation comes along, creates these social injustices. And of course, if they lie to you, they're going to lie about you. If they cheat with you, they're going to cheat on you. If they steal with you, they're going to steal from you. The idea here is that if there's an infestation, it is going to eventually backfire on you. And so now they have to what? Fall into possession, I'm sorry, oppression and then possession, which is that nation's controlled by some demonic force. Why? Because they're killing humans, right? They're killing humans and animals with malevolent purposes. And now they cry out, and all of a sudden, what happens? Yahweh sends a judge to unite Israel, and they deliver themselves. You can never deliver another individual. They have to deliver themselves. That's going to be important in all this information. But we need to keep going. We need to keep going. Okay. So what do we understand about expansion? The whole idea behind expansion has to do with what is going to occur in order for it to be a new experience of this third principle. So let's get back to our board. And specifically, we're going to look back at expansion. What is the key to expansion? The key to expansion is to create more potential or to, and this is important, this is probably the most important part of this message, is that there is going to be the creation of a space. Create a space. Okay, so now what we have is we have the premise of expansion. And actually, I'm going to change the color on that one to, let's say we go with this. Okay, so here is expansion. Okay, now the reason why expansion is so important is because there are times when we will look at a circumstance and we will think God is not taking care of us. God is not speaking. God is not doing what he promised he would do, right? He's not helping me. He's not working with me. But what does it drive us to do? Well, let's start at the beginning here. What is the concept of the first principle? The concept of the first principle is going to be reception, right? And I actually didn't write that in there. Let me go ahead and write that in there real quick. Reception. And the reason that this is important is because reception is the beginning of understanding. Receiving is the beginning of understanding. Why? Because it's going to bring you to a new knowledge or a new storing of information that will later on become the frame of reference by which you operate. That way, what is true here about information, what's that information? I am a greater vessel. Therefore, it's not a big deal that I have been reduced. A reduction or decrease has occurred, a death is occurring, but I'm absolutely aware that I am a greater, and that means that I can be filled again and that I will pour out again. And so there's actually a beautiful cycle of benevolence here, right? On the understanding of the lesser vessel, there's a benevolence from the greater vessel and therefore an expectation, which I'll explain in a minute. That expectation is that there will be provision, protection, and instruction come from the greater. That expectation, if it is betrayed, turns into something else, which I'll explain in a minute. Or maybe I might not touch on that today. We'll see. But the premise is now what we have is we have the fullness in this first one, right? So this is basically the idea of being unlearned. And what is this state? Which earlier today I said that an unlearned person is wrong. Why are they wrong? Because they actually don't know the information that they need to know in order for everything to be present in its correct context, which means what? This is, again, an unlearned vessel, which means they're wrong about that information that's present here because they don't have it yet. They're ignorant of it, which means that they're going to only use their frames of reference, which means something very specific is going to occur here. Something very important is going to occur here. And that's going to result in a decision. And that decision is going to be what? The ability to trust the greater, that's greater than it, to take care of that missing amount of energy, purpose, and authority. Remember, all this information is already known. So it's interesting. Here, there's nothing to know. This is all it believes it is, right? So benevolence in its simplicity, the second principle or elevation is all based upon what? No new information. Here, this is revelation, right? This is what? This is unknown information. Results in what? Confusion, cognitive dissonance, right? Cognitive dissonance, etc. Okay, so now why is that so important? Well, think about the word of, okay? Pharisee comes to, well, I don't know what it was. I don't know if it was a Pharisee, but somebody comes to Yeshua and says, what is the greatest commandment? In Mark, he says, Shema Israel, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, V'havta et Yahweh Eloheka b'kol levavka, uv'kol nafsheka, uv'kol me'adeka. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And then he says something interesting because they never asked it. He says the second is like it. Like it. Remember, likeness in Hebrew has to do with shadows. And shadows are the result of a blocking of light. Meaning what? Like it is a lesser. We'll get to that. So the premise is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, is somehow violating the entire premise of this entire teaching, but also the entire premise of what we've seen in nature and understood, which is what? That you could possibly give to an upper Elohim, that you could actually transfer energy to an upper Elohim. Okay? Now, this is where it becomes very important for you to understand that the only way in which for you to do something for a greater is to receive. Okay? Receive provision, protection, instruction, receive authority, energy, and purpose. Okay? So, in all of that, it is important to understand that information that comes will result in the identity that you are a lesser. Once you receive and realize you're a lesser, then you actually have the potential to realize that there's got to be another lesser below you. That revelation in that moment changes you from what? Dependence to to independence, in which you begin to really realize that you are receiving in order to what? In order to pass to another, potentially, right? But then there's a moment where there's interdependence, where there is actually kind of a connection between, oh, well, I have this strength and I have this weakness, and this person has this weakness and this strength, and therefore we come together and we come into balance. Because why? Synergy is the idea that the whole of all of the parts, or the sum of the whole of all the parts, is greater than the one itself. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to ask the question, if it says love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and God is love, we need to understand that the benevolent energy starts here without a whole lot of filtration, okay? But we need to look back into our model that says, look at what has been made. Well, this one's a harder one, because now we're going to have to look at the human brain, because the human brain is going to actually teach us about Torah. Why? Because what the human brain does is it uses frames of reference or learned information in order to create constructs about the future. Okay. And so now we need to get into the premise of a completed or a perfect action, and an imperfect action being something that has not been completed. Why? Because what Yahweh actually says in the Ten Commandments is he says, kill not, steal not. How does it actually read? You will steal not. You will murder not. Right? It's creating a future tense and putting a negation particle on it, creating what? Interference with the frames of references that are already present. You will steal. Where do we learn about stealing? From a frame of reference of stealing. Not. In other words, he creates future constructs based upon our information that we already have, and then creates a negation particle on it. Now, the reason why that is so relevant and important is because now we understand that there is a choice, or there's a potential to steal. He is that negation particle on that. Okay, that's going to be important, because the question that arose is, what happens to the God of the Bible and all the worshiping and all the bowing down and all the other things if Marcion and Augustine were not right, and Yahweh is not a malevolent God, and Christ was some benevolent God, because that's kind of what they propose, and all humans are malevolent beings, and only Christ is the benevolent being, then we start to get into the process, or the idea that the actual human potential is benevolence. But here's the intrigue. We have to return to elevation. I'll explain to you how and why. This right here is always going to manifest verbally. Now, I know you can't really see it, but that is the new cost. No, there's no cost there, because there was no pouring out. This is an expansion. This is a movement from one state to a new state as a result of a reciprocation on the willingness of a greater to pour out its benevolent energies into a lesser, and be willing to be dead. Remember, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord, and he will raise you up. Well, in the intrigue of this, then we accept that there is a function or process by which expansion occurs as a result of information no longer being present. In other words, all of a sudden life becomes confusing. It seems as though maybe it might be falling apart. It seems as though something might be going wrong. And our instant reaction to it could and will be fear, which means this entire void that occurs within a human being in that expansion, that's supposed to be potential for more energy, more authority, right? more purpose, and remember, purpose is accompanied with the abundance to accomplish the purpose, right? We fear. And as a result of that fear, we make these micro adjustments. And we're going to talk a minute about information here again in a minute. The short version is like kind attracts like kind. You make a micro adjustment toward the malevolent process as a result of fear, you are going to attract malevolent processes. In other words, you could potentially attract that thing to you that you fear. Instead of understanding that there's an expansion occurring, instead of understanding that new information is coming, a new identity. In that process, it is also important to understand that things come down from above, but there's still something that goes up from below. Remember the focus or the concept of elevation. And here it is. So we have this idea that expansion creates what? A new void. That new void results in the identity of the identity of the greater now being the identity of a lesser, a realization that there's a need for a greater. And so now watch how this works. There's a need for a greater, and therefore in that function of a need for a greater, there's a return to the identity of a lesser. And that whole process begins again, which means what? Which means the only way in which that can occur is if there is a elevation. Remember, elevation has two processes to it. What's that elevation? That elevation is the acknowledgement of a greater to receive. In other words, I will allow you to fill me, right? I will allow you to come into me and create an expansion. Remember, or not an expansion, but an intensification. Remember that intensification will go straight all the way to its limitations and then begin to empty itself out into a lesser. Intensify, lesser pour out, intensify, lesser pour out. But now here's the crazy part. As that's occurring now, what? We're moving into new information. New information is going to be what? That idea that, oh, I have become an even greater vessel. Now, why is that so important? Because in that process of humble thyself in the sight of the Lord, and he will raise you up into a position of honor, who's raising him up into a position of honor but the lesser who's willing to receive? Which means what? The cycle repeats itself again. How is there a communication between the lesser and the greater that there is a willingness to receive? Remember that first principle was no, right? So let's put that up there. No. Yes, with condition. Right? Yes, with condition. And so, and then what? A return again to no. Why? Because that void hurts. Anger with God. You know what? I'm done with God. I cannot believe I'm going through this. He's supposed to protect me. He's supposed to create justice, etc., etc. And you don't realize that what's actually happening at that moment is you are actually stepping into a new season. And in that new season is coming more abundance for purpose, abundance of energy, abundance of authority, right? Abundance of purpose. There's a new purpose. There's a new expansion occurring. And only way in which you can actually function as that new greater is to cry out, right? Cry out. And therefore, what's intriguing is the way in which you acknowledge that you are a lesser is you pray. Now, do you pray the way that we've been instructed by humanity thus far? Do you pray by repeating prayers that have no value or emotional attachment to them? No, that's written knowledge. Do we believe written knowledge? No, we don't believe written knowledge. The only reason we believe written knowledge is if it lines up with our experiential knowledge as a result of what? A function, a witness that it's true. And therefore, we need to understand that the communication of prayer, or the transference of information from a lesser to a greater, to acknowledge that it is the greater, is we create a what? A willingness to receive. We create a space. By what? Pouring out. You literally create a space for a greater to pour into you by pouring into a lesser. That is the function. And therefore, you give energy, right? You grant jurisdictional authority to a lesser. That's a very different concept of prayer, isn't it? Creating a space for the greater to pour in. Creating a space. Creating a temple, right? Creating a void that can be filled. This is the concept of consummation, right? This is the concept of lying down and receiving, humbling yourself, lowering yourself, receive from the greater that will overshadow you, and inside of you, the seed of inception. What is inception? It's the beginning of something new that connects with what you already know and have to become something new, a new creation. That new creation will not be the same vessel, new vessel. There's a number of ways we could look at this philosophically. This is what? Creating a new student, et cetera, et cetera. But the whole principle is that as we open to receive, that is when we experience through the unction, the truth, what works. Love, right? Love. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. Love your neighbor as yourself. Remember the Sabbath day. You shall have no other gods before me. Don't take my name in vain. Don't make graven images. Honor your mother and father. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't commit adultery. Don't covet, right? And don't bear false witness. 613 commandments, all deriving from that single energy of benevolence, passed through filters of frames of reference in each Elohim. Each Elohim has a frame of reference from what? The lesser, giving information to the greater, saying, you are actually a greater. And I'm going to prove it to you because I'm going to open myself to receive. And as I open myself to receive, I'm going to create a space by which you can pour into me. Now that Elohim knows the frame of reference and necessity. So now we understand why we have over 1,048 commandments is the result of what? And why we have Talmud and Catechism and bylaws and the Westminster Confession. Because why? Because down here we're vibrating at a very low frequency. But as we move upward in what? In elevation, as a result of a change in status, as a result of a willingness to receive, as a result of a reciprocation of giving to someone else, now all of a sudden out of the middle of nowhere, we have new knowledge, new revelation, and therefore vibrate at a higher frequency. And we no longer need to be told, thou shalt not kill, because there's something inside of us, unction, that speaks to the experiential knowledge within us that we should not expire another life, which eliminates the pagan nations and eradicates them which is why Joshua was given that commandment in the first place. But then we also have the other side of this thing where we are supposed to elevate the foreigner. We are supposed to elevate the stranger. We are supposed to elevate our fellow Hebrews, the ones who still have the twisted minds continuing from birth, the imagination of violence and evil continually. So now I think you understand that the only thing that can go upward is information acknowledging a need. I need more money. I need, right? Because you're going through a void. I need more food. I need more knowledge. I need more time with you. You see, the intensification of all power in the universe never is receiving that information. Because once it arrives at the Elohim who's supposed to give that, that's as far as it goes. That Elohim is communicating a greater need to that Elohim, to that Elohim, that Elohim. And therefore, your prayer is actually going all the way up the chain to the intensification of all power in the universe, who dumps at a cost, but who dumps. Now, we won't get into the cost that the intensification of all power in the universe has. Why? Because he's the source. But we could do the 99% light and the 1% darkness and say that there is a potential for that to empty so much of itself that it drops to 98% light. Now we understand how a contraction actually occurs. And so in a weird sort of way, we're actually this cycle of Elohim. Now, in that process, you need to understand that, remember, all an Elohim is a covenant maker. Somebody who makes an agreement with somebody else to do or to accomplish something for a greater purpose of them both. So now we understand why sometimes there could be a divine intervention and sometimes there might not be a divine intervention. Because why? It's something we're supposed to be doing. Oftentimes we will pray for something that we're supposed to be accomplishing through our authority, our energy, which is lacking in Christianity because we're so afraid of it, right? Authority, it depends on which sect of Christianity we're talking about. And what? Purpose. What happens when your purpose goes past your morals and dogma, and so you refuse it? What happens when you're called to heal with energy that your pulpit's telling you you're not supposed to be playing with? That happened to me. When Yahweh brought Sabbath into my life, I thought the devil was trying to put me under the law. Because the pulpit told me that that's what would happen. That the devil would try to put me under the law because the law was oppressive. The same law that Yeshua said, if you teach somebody to break, you will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom of heaven is within you, so therefore you will be called a lesser vessel. Even if you had the potential to be a greater vessel, which when we talk about status change, there's always going to be a greater, lesser. Whatever is the greater, probably got somebody bigger, and whatever is the lesser, probably got somebody smaller. So in that principle, then we understand now the necessity to give in order to receive. It's literally the concept that if you pour yourself out, you are communicating to the intensification of the power. You need more and you need expansion. So don't get mad when it happens because you're the one that created it in the first place. And here's the crazy part about it is when it says, well, Lord, he will raise you up to a position of honor. When you pour out and you get up under somebody and give them the elevation status, it will reciprocate to you. And what does that mean? It means that you're the one who actually creates that void. You're the one who actually creates the expansion. Last time I checked, maternity, that human will choice, a choice to carry a child, choice to allow that child to become a creation, a choice to overlook the reasons and the processes by which all of that occurred and to allow a new vessel to exist. And then the premise that you also need to make a choice to bring that vessel to that place. And then you need to help that vessel at maturation understand, don't let the infestations create an oppression in your life that would eventually become a possession. Don't get me wrong, you can cry out, deliver yourself, and move on to the next thing. So now we come into a very interesting concept. If you actually can't heal a person, what are you doing? Creating a space for them to heal, right? But then also for them to heal themselves, actually. That's why. Because the perfect entity of intensification is already present within the Elohim to its limitations. And if those limitations haven't expanded, that's how far that intensification occurs. It's present within them, which means what? You are guiding them into healing themselves. Now you say, wait a minute, well, what about the times when Yeshua told the demon who was throwing the guy in the fire or whatever to get out of him? Or what about the times when Yeshua told the ear to be opened or whatever? First of all, let me say this. That's a translation of that's a copy of a translation of an original document. But also, in other words, we don't really know what actually was said. We just know that the concept of the story was carried over. But also, another thing is that's exactly what he was doing, was creating a space for her. Now, some people say, wait a minute, what you're saying is that you have the power within yourself to heal yourself and no one else can actually heal you. And therefore, Paul didn't actually heal people. And when Yeshua said, go out and heal the sick, that they weren't the actual ones healing them. Yes. But what you need to understand is when it says heal the sick, what is the space that's actually created? Silver and gold have I none, but what I have give I thee. In the name of Yeshua of Nazareth, get up and walk. What was Peter doing there? Well, who's going to get up? The man. If he gets up, what's happening? He is accepting the energy from the greater to get up. Did energy come out of Peter? Yes, through voice, right? Those vibrations, which we don't completely understand. But that's all communication is vibration. An opening and closing in the mouth, and positioning of the tongue. But it's still all vibrations. We perceive it as communication because we somehow along the way, as humanity, develop words instead of sounds, grunts, etc. We communicate at a much higher level, which means what? We're vibrating at a higher level. Well, we won't get into that. But the premise is that what you got to get your mind around, or the ideal is that the only way in which the universe has communicated to us that we are supposed to be experiencing something better than the circumstances that we're currently in. In other words, when we cry out and seek deliverance, as if we deliver ourselves, and therefore that means that we have to believe that we are unable to do that. But also we have to what? Accept the abundance. But we always accept abundance or receive the abundance with the intention to equally distribute it or to give. The abundance of purpose will always exist as the resources to accomplish what you need to accomplish and be filled and to fill others. Those are the three purposes behind abundance. You pour out in order to receive. That creates the space by which now there can be a filling. If you've already exceeded your potential in information about your identity, then you what? Expand. When you expand, there is a void, and that void is scary, which makes you what? Want to cry out for fear that you are in some sort of trouble. That crying out is actually an acknowledgement that you what? That you need to receive. How do you tell the universe that you need to receive? You pour out. Do you get the concept here? You pour out in order to receive. That communicates that this is definitely that greater dumped into you, and therefore now you have been filled. That filling creates information about your potential and about who you are, your identity. Once that identity has moved in status, there's an expansion. That expansion then will be a new identity. That new identity will never, ever, ever be the identity that you had. Now be forewarned. James says that we are led away of our own lusts. And lust, when it is conceived, becomes sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, becomes death. There is literally a dark side to this message, which is that you can actually go the opposite direction of benevolence, depending on how you see. Remember, it doesn't say that you won't sow darkness, that you won't sow to the flesh. It says, if you sow to the flesh, you will reap corruption, a greater malevolence. See, in what capacity you are capable of being good, you are capable of being evil. And so if you have been a dark, horrible, evil person, you have the power to be an amazing healer, benevolent, effective human being. Be forewarned. There's a maintenance there. And that maintenance is based on fear. Why? Because it says when we're led away of our own lust. Well, people don't understand what lust is. Lust is literally the fear of not having. Okay? And so when we are working with lust, which is technically covetousness, which is one of the 10 commandments, we are working with where we are desiring something that we're not supposed to have. Right? That's controlled by what? By that original love. Love the Lord your God. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with soul, and the might. Love the neighbor as yourself. And then the 10, and then the 613, and then the 1048, and then the Talmud, the bylaws, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, into a concept of what? You're not supposed to do that. And if you're not supposed to do that, then you can't want that. And if you want that, then you have already adjusted, made micro adjustments to bring that into your life. And therefore you have coveted, and therefore you have drawn to yourself that darkness, those choices, right? So there's more, right? There's this concept that if we are working with that process of the Word of God coming down as an energy and eventually manifesting into these commandments, and as it moves lower and lower and lower and frequency becomes a solid, now we can understand how the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. However, that word sarx in the Greek, sarx, flesh, is an idiom for the ego. So what? The Word became an ego and dwelt among us. Was in always tempted but did not sin. Greater things than this we can do. If he was in always tempted and did not sin, right? Sin is a transgression of the Torah. If he's in always tempted and does not sin, you're supposed to exceed what he does. And you can understand now that that had nothing to do with where he came from, right? Because he's this original thought of benevolence broken down into these filters by these other Elohim who have experiential knowledge, because that's what it teaches us in this realm is our God. And we have to accept then that there is a principle that Yahweh Elohim has frames of reference by which he filters that benevolent energy down into something that we can receive or accept or whatever. We understand that our prayers going up to him are meaningless in terms of the words that we actually say. But when we create a space, there is going to be a filling, no matter what. If there's a void, it will be filled as long as we open ourselves, go from no to yes with condition. Right? What is the condition? Trust. Right? What is the condition? Willingness to believe that it's not going to go bad. that if we open ourselves to receive, that it's not going to go bad. That reception and that feeling results in information that we understand, and it elevates us, creates revelation, etc., etc. Now, I talked about the malevolent energies, and I talked about the idea of being evil or being good in what capacity you're able to, etc., etc. Now I'm going to blow your mind. Remember, I said that a vessel that has information that has exceeded its potential to move, that has exceeded its potential will move to a higher status. And that higher status eventually leads to that 99% light and that 1% darkness, and you can't go any higher. What if I told you that we've already been given all of that information? So we need to accept that by the time we get to the Septuagint, the word theos is replacing the word Elohim, and that Yahweh Elohim was an entity that was to be acknowledged as the greater. Let me take that back. The greatest of the graders. Okay? Not as if the lower Elohim are giving him some sort of counsel. He went to Job and said, hey, do me a favor. If you could meet this criteria, I got some questions for you. And of course, Job was like, my bad, right? But the premise is that there is never a point where an Elohim can give a greater counsel. And so we know that the intensification of all power in the universe, as as emanated or transformed down into a perceivable God that has some semblance of limitation or identity, we can now functionally understand is the highest known entity that we could possibly perceive. Okay? So Yahweh Elohim is absolutely the fullest extent of the intensification of all power in the universe that we can actually understand, and has assigned as identity Father. But what is that energy in that place? Provision, protection, instruction, sure, right? But what else do we have present? That love, as it were, that benevolent energy changing and being filtered into love, which is a positive regard, right? An unconditional positive regard. And then we have what? And then we have this connection or relationship in that way. Then we have what? Husband, which creates the consummation idea, right? And that consummation idea then results in us having that very different understanding of what the bride of Yeshua is, right? But here's the interesting thing. Remember, I said that a vessel that has exceeded its potential will have all of the knowledge or all of the information available to it about its potential, and will operate in that purpose without understanding until an expansion occurs, right? Remember, this is no new information here, which means but if we were ever given the information that we were the 1% light, or the 99% light and the 1% darkness, then we will have exceeded our potential beyond something that we could ever understand, because the next level is the intensification of all power in the universe. Therefore, if there was a verse or a scripture that said that we were something that would indicate that we were the 99% night and the 1% darkness, or the first principle or the first Elohim that exceeds even that perceivable God of Yahweh, then we would actually have exceeded our potential. You ready for this? He made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God. We have already been given the status of 99% light and 1% darkness. Why? Because the only thing that can happen as the righteousness of God is a downward pour. Can't receive. Now, each Elohim is the righteousness of God, but the righteousness of the intensification of all power in the universe, where we have the transference of the word Elohim to the word theos, which in contemporary Greek culture is going to be Zeus, Athena, etc., right? It's going to be the gods. And we understand that when it says he made him who knew no sin to become sin for us, that the transference of energies, all of the malevolent energies that could be attracted as a result of that covetousness were attracted to him, and he became 100% darkness, which is where we get that idea of being in the belly of the earth. 100% darkness in order for us to become 99% light, which is a long way to go, because now we get into something interesting. The only way for a vessel to operate in its purpose is to believe that that's its purpose. We don't believe that we are the righteousness of God. We operate in our wounds, our entitlements. We have a lack of imagination unless it comes to fear, and then we have this huge imagination. We already are everything that we have the potential to be, but we don't believe it. And therefore, we only allow a little trickle in. And as we allow that little trickle in, we gain a little bit more revelation, a little bit more information, line upon line, precept upon precept. We never actually just accept our status. We're already there. Because if there's no such thing as time in the realm of the intensification of all power in the universe, we've already arrived, which means we've already begun to pour out, which means we've already become a lesser, emptier vessel in status, right? Or not, I'm sorry, not in status, but in information. Remember, as this one pours out, it remembers that it is actually the greater, but it still pours out even below the status of a lesser. The Word became flesh and dwelt among men. Flesh being the ego. That word sarx being the ego, the part of us that basically doesn't realize that we're Elohim, right? The part of us that masks our brain from the fact that we are the intensification of all power in the universe. But then what's interesting is we forget that the entire universe is trying to teach us about it. And the entire universe is responding to what? Our authority and energy and power, right? And purpose. You say, well, wait a minute, what about, say, like Pharaoh? Well, he was raised up for a purpose. He was. I never said that purpose was positive or negative. How many times have you been in a situation where you created and messed up a whole entire group of people or friends or whatever, right? As a result of a rumor or something like that, and it ruined a person's life, breaking an amazing human being. Don't get me started with that thought process. Okay, finally. Now you understand you've already been given all that information, which means that you have the ability to what? To pour completely out and still be the intensification of all power in the universe. You'll never do it because of your fear. You'll never do it because of all your frames of reference and information. You're deleting, distorting, and generalizing. But I can tell you, you already are it, which means under the right circumstances, we could, as a species, evolve into something more amazing. Now, I mentioned that you need to give in order to receive, and that receiving is actually the crying out. I'm sorry, that emphasis is actually the crying out. Do you say words? Of course we're going to say words. We're going to be like, I can't do this. Now, what we need to accept is that the entire universe is actually Elohim. And what I mean by that is that when we stop or when we start at 99% light, 1% darkness, that's part of the universe. That's part of the existence of reality. Because the intensification of all time in the universe dialed itself back that little percent in order to create space for something to exist. There's that creative space again. And now all of a sudden what we have is this idea that then he gave it the ability to what? To intensify itself. And that intensity then results in an understanding that I can't go past this 1% darkness. Therefore, something's wrong. I can't give any information out. I can't teach this. I can't send information. I can't tell that entity that it is what it is. I can acknowledge that it is what it is. But then what do I do then? Well, that's simple. Contraction. And that contraction occurs and that void occurs. And now there's a new place for a new space, etc., 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 down to us. But here's the crazy part. We also, in that other realm, are already all of that energy. It's time. Already happened. In other words, this whole entire cycle doesn't even really exist except in our minds. And that's why we won't just get up there where we belong. We have to go through these gradual expansions to get there. Now, does an expansion result in a movement from 1% light and 99% darkness to 2% light, 98% darkness? No. This is all within that realm. That expansion is actually all within that realm. You know my proof? Does a lady take over a city when she's pregnant? No. That little bit of expansion takes up some space, but doesn't take up the world. And so you need to think that way. You need to think macrocosmically that you're not actually taking up space as you expand. However, that energy is coming from somewhere and is therefore a cost. There's a cost somewhere. And that cost usually results in reciprocal costs coming to you. Look at Paul's life. The man had the greatest revelation of anybody who believed in Christ, in my opinion. He was left for dead, stoned, starved, almost drowned, shipwrecked, bitten by snakes, beaten again, almost to death, stoned almost to death, imprisoned, in chains. For what we understand, probably had his wife taken away from him, definitely had his son seem to have betrayed him, at the very least, definitely did not align with his beliefs, right? You're saying, where are you getting all this from? You know what? That's yours to see. But the premise is that this man went through so much cost to go to the third heaven, to communicate that we were Elohim, to communicate that we were sons of Elohim, to communicate that all of creation knows that we are and is frustrated because we won't wake up. And when we do finally wake up, some will shine as bright as the sky, and some will go to what? Everlasting contempt. Well, that's not quite what that means in the Hebrew, but the premise is that they will not be effective. Then there's the function of when you wake up, what are you supposed to do, right? Well, where do we start? What are we supposed to do? It's simple. You now wait to attract that lesser Elohim to give in order to receive, because that's the only way in which a prayer is going to be answered. What is that prayer? I acknowledge that you are greater than me. So now we're looking for guidance, we're looking for protection and provision, right? Provision, protection, and instruction. Where are we getting that instruction? Well, it's just like me when I do these services, when I do these sermons. What was the question today? What am I supposed to do with the information that I have about a Christian God when I'm giving all this information about Elohim? Now I understand. I get it. But I had to go through this message to get there. I had to understand the whole process. Did I think about that process all week? Nope. I blocked it out of my mind until today when I started speaking. Why? Because I'm creating a space for new information. That new information is just a simple experiential knowledge with a spiritual unction for me to go in a certain direction. Whatever direction it wants to go, I just flow with it. And that's why sometimes it just sounds so chaotic, right? Chaos and etc. Right? And so create a space for there to be something put there. Create a space for something to move towards. Create a space. Remember, the universe is going to be obedient. Like kind attracts like kind. As you begin to intend, as you begin to assert your authority and will to move in the direction of giving to and receiving to give, you are going to actually move into that process, and you're going to attract to yourself the lessers that need you. Now, let's say that we do the opposite. Let's say that we start to move away from our purpose, away from our energy, away from our authority. Remember last week's lesson that creates what? An opposite. Not attraction, but a lack of attraction and a pushing away, a moving away of your vessels of reception, and therefore you not being able to pour out, and therefore you not being able to receive, which means your prayers won't be answered. Now we understand why it says, dwell with your wife as a lesser vessel, lest your prayers not be answered. Right? So now we understand that there's a deeper, greater understanding to these verses about marriage, about covenant, about all these things that pertain to inception, reception, conception. Now you understand what it means to pray. Now you understand what it means to have a prayer answered. Now you understand how that function works. You say, so are you saying my prayers are conditional? Absolutely they are. The only way you can receive something more than what you have right now is reciprocation. That's the law. That's the rule. You don't get freebies. You want freebies? Go all the way to the top. 99% light, 1% darkness. Stop believing that you're a human being. Stop believing that there's any fear that could possibly happen. Stop accepting the temptation of sin. And maybe, just maybe, you can say those things, but you can't right now. Can't. Because all you do is fear. All you do is react. I haven't even gotten you guys away from pork yet. So in principle, we understand that it has to do with what? Frequency, a higher vibration of frequency. That vibration is something that we don't understand because why? It exceeds our sight, our perceptions, our sensory perceptions. What does that result in? That results in us being stuck. Well, guess what? That's what's actually going on in your body. Solids are stuck in some sort of way and need to flow, move, right? They need to find a way through. Now, those are sometimes energies that need to be moved through, right? Sometimes those are malevolent energies that what? Suck light that need to move through, which are roots of bitterness, etc., resentment. But you need to understand that the entire universe is responding to that. The entire universe, look, when Moses says, I call heaven and earth as witness against you, you need to understand he asked every single last molecule in existence, in the sky, in the clouds, in your bodies, everything, to witness that he set before you life and death, a blessing and a curse. Choose life that you might live. I call heaven and earth. And now we understand that concept of who shall go up to get Torah. Nobody can. And Paul says that is for Christ to ascend, right? Or who shall what? Bring it down, as if to bring Christ down into the earth. Why was that important? Because a lot of people think that the resurrection power occurred at Yeshua's death, but the truth is he walked around saying, can't kill me. If I decide to let you, if I decide to die, if I decide to let you kill me, then you can kill me, but you can't kill me. I don't function on those rules. Polycarp did too. Polycarp's sitting there and he's like, look, guys, the fire's not going to burn me. It's being obedient to me. It's not going to touch me. And it didn't. No matter how hard they tried, they stoked the fire. They put all this stuff under it. Gave him powder. They put powder kegs under it, something like that. And finally, he was like, okay, just so you know that I had control over it, now I'll die, and dies. Dies singing a hymn, supposedly, right? So where are we at with all that? Was Polycarp somebody special that Christ chose to propagate the gospel, and then after it's done, now there's no more power, energy, and authority? Come. Persons. Sure, it's probably served a purpose, and we could accept purpose because Pharaoh was raised up for a purpose. But you guys understand now how the word of God descends, how the prayers ascend, and how all of this process is actually done, completed already, which is why Yeshua can say, believe you have received it. Use visualization to put that into practice. That's for another day. But all I want you to understand is that there is a cost for the amount of energy that you're going to expend. There's going to be a death, and that death needs to give space to resurrection. And if there's an expansion, there's going to be a huge death, and you need to give space to resurrection. Always offering resurrection to the lesser vessel. Okay? So for those of you who are on YouTube, I will say Shabbat Shalom. And yeah, let's go ahead and end it.